and welcome everybody to Virtual Voices. This was a series created back in March when COVID hit. It has flowed into really important conversations about a lot of topics, but this year in 2021, we are dedicated to conversations about race and racism. You'll hear a lot more about this series from Monica, our moderator today. I want to give you just a few quick Zoom reminders. First of all, I'm Elizabeth Peruch with the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation, and we're thrilled to bring you Virtual Voices in partnership with TIDE. Again, Monica will give you a little bit about that, and they're a partner group of ours. So Zoom reminders, very important, I think, for everyone to realize there's a lot of folks on this call. Please stay muted. We will be kind of toggling between speaker view and the opportunity to see others in the room if you'd like to. You can also manage that on your own in the little 3 dots above. We are going to be recording this session and sharing it out afterwards. So I hope you're okay with being recorded. Smile pretty. Finally, we are really going to ask you to use that chat feature as much as possible. If you have resources, if you have questions, if you have any kind of encouragement or anything you want to add to that chat feature, please use it. I will be watching, we will all be watching. It's a place for you all to engage with each other as leaders. If you have any questions, please reach out to Megan Vivier from a technical side. Thank you, Megan. And then finally, I want to just thank our sponsors. This would not be possible without these 3 amazing sponsors. They collectively help support the Leadership Foundation and all of our engagement with our alumni, and now this ability to bring it to all of you beyond just our network. And we are thrilled with Molson Coors Beverage Company, Southwest Airlines, and TIAA, really true thought partners in the work that we're doing. So thank you to them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Monica Williams. Monica is not only a mentor to me, she's a mentor to many people. We are thrilled to have her as a partner with the Leadership Foundation through her work at TIDE, which is Talent, Inclusion, Engagement, and Diversity. She is right now currently not just the president, co-founder of TIDE, but also an executive producer and expert consultant for the Equity Project. Many of you may have heard of that. Monica has a long corporate history in doing diversity and equity work at DIAA, 25 years with CenturyLink. She's got a background to back up her experience. She's a tremendous leader in our community. We are thrilled to have her here. This is her life's work. She speaks freely, she speaks honestly, respectfully, and she is just a treat and a joy to work with. And so she's a skilled facilitator. So Monica, I am going to hand this to you. I thank you all for being a part of this, and take it away, Monica.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce Leadership Foundation. Your partnership has been invaluable in curating and co-creating this content that we're going to share today. It's so important for us to be having these conversations at a time like this. And so I really want to give a special thanks also to our planning committee. Our planning committee consists of Dr. Michael Benitez, who you will hear from today, also Tasha Jones, Tom Romero, Roberto Montoya, and Kirsten Vermeulen. And we have spent a great deal of time to ensure that we're capturing and really challenging our audiences to think and consider how race and racism is impacting us both today and what the connection is to the history. The history is an important piece of this. And I also want to thank the TIDE board. The TIDE board consists of Jason Clark, who I had to call out by name because, you know, in this work, you don't do it alone. And so I just want to make sure I'm bringing special attention to this TIDE board. And TIDE board is Jason Clark, Michelle Fix-Westhall, Casey Qualia, and Ana Pena, and Luisa Alvarez, our newest board member. And just to give you a little bit of background on TIDE, TIDE is made up of a 60+ member company, and we have been in existence since 2011. TIDE seeks out to inform audiences to equip HR business leaders and also diversity and inclusion practitioners to equip those audiences so that they can be the most effective in their organizations as possible. And since 2011, we have been dedicated and committed to bringing in the thought leadership around the conversation of talent, inclusion, engagement, diversity, which is how we get our name. And so I wanted to give you that in terms of background in TIDE and the importance of having this conversation. So the Virtual Voices, as Elizabeth mentioned, was really started last year with the death and murder of George Floyd. And we've decided and partnered with the Leadership Foundation to continue this virtual series. And we want to start with the history. We must start with the history of race and racism, and really to interrogate the systems that still exist today. It is a time where, you know, just recently, we may be feeling very triumphant and glad to be starting a new chapter with the election of President Joe Biden and this monumental election of Vice President, first Black woman, first Asian American woman in the Vice President, Kamala Harris. Very historical, very monumental, and yet we still have so much work to do. We still have so much work to do to dismantle, to disrupt the systems of oppression that exist in our systems today. The systems I'm talking about, and I'd give one person, $100, if you can tell me one system that we're grappling with that was created with equity in mind. I struggle to find one system, not the judicial system, not our educational system, not our financial system, not housing, healthcare, not one system that was created with equity in mind. And so these are the challenges that we still face. But guess what? The systems of inequity and oppression and white supremacy and discrimination started when this nation was formed. It started with a particular goal. Like, if you think about it, these systems of oppression and discrimination and the brutality that came with slavery and that came with, these systems being legislated. It was legal to own slaves. It was legal to discriminate. It was legal and institutionalized. And so we would be remiss if we didn't consider that history and look at the thread and the connection and the remnants in today's systems. And so we do this interrogation. Now, we can love this nation and love this country and still be critical of it. Be critical of it in a way that now we're ready to address the inequities that have existed for so long, but do so intentionally. And when we look at history, we can't just look at the history, the parts that make us proud. We also have to look at the parts that appall us, the parts that make us cringe, the parts that we're not proud of. We have to look at those parts too and tell the whole story, get the whole picture. And I think that, I know, that is what's been missing. We hear parts of the story, but we don't hear the whole part. And we certainly don't always hear and see the correlation to how the origination of a thing, where it started and how it continues to play out. We're still living our history. And so today's conversation, we really want, and all of you as leaders, we really want to think about that history, the connections of today, and what's your role? What's your role in addressing the inequity? When you go back to your workplaces, your businesses, your engagements in the community, and however you work, live, play, and give, look at where are the opportunities to dismantle, to deconstruct, to interrogate, and to take down systems of inequity. Systems of inequity that put communities of color at a disadvantage or that have disparate outcomes. We shouldn't be able to determine outcomes based on race. That's just not right, but it still seems to be the case in these systems of inequity. And so this conversation is important for that reason. And so we have some very profound speakers that we're going to have this conversation. And so there might be times where it feels uncomfortable. If there might be times where we do have to look at ourselves in the mirror as a nation and as a country and decide Where are my opportunities in my everyday interactions to disrupt and to take down these systems of inequity, but then in return to build something that's equitable in its place? That's the key. And we all have the ability to do that. And so I want to introduce to you some of the presenters that will be talking today. And I hope you don't mind me reading this, but I know that you're going to be thrilled and informed and engaged by this conversation today. So, first speaker, Dr. Michael Benitez. Dr. Michael Benitez is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Metro State University. Over the past 2 decades, Dr. Benitez has served higher education in different capacities, including academic and student affairs, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and teaching. He is a nationally acclaimed scholar, practitioner in higher education, and a highly sought speaker and workshop leader at universities, colleges, and conferences nationwide. I've already learned so much from him, and so I know that today this conversation will invigorate you and cause you to think, and that's really what we're hoping to do. Cause you to think and then act. That's the key. And then we also will have Dr. Devin Wright. Devin Wright holds a PhD in sociology with Florida International University's Global Social Cultural Studies program. He is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Metropolitan State University of Denver, teaching various courses. And his research interests focus on Black protest movements, racism, and conservative right-wing social movement organizations, particularly white supremacist ideology and racist rhetoric in conservative right-wing media. And so thank you so much for both of you being here. I'm so excited to have this very important conversation with you. And so let's just go. My first question, and please take the time that you need to kind of give us your first words, your first remarks. Why do we need to be particularly interested in race and racism in the United States? Why does it matter?
Right on. So first, Monica, thank you for the kind introduction. To everyone who helped put this together, gratitude. And to my brother, Dr. Devin Wright, appreciation in sharing space with you. First, let me just start off by acknowledging the land that we stand. So I want to, be sure that I acknowledge the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and other nations whose land we continue to utilize, stand on, occupy, and to which we owe much to. Secondly, I'd like to introduce myself in my native tongue. Usa Weyu Watyao Diri, Mike Benitez of Afro-Taino Arawak descent, son of the island of Borinquen. And that's so important for me to acknowledge that indigeneity with respect to the space that we stand on. And to your question, Monica, it's such a good one in particular. When I think about why it's important, I'm thinking about the way, to open up that, at this time, historians, scholars, activists alike have finally come to the conclusion they have for some time now that race is an invention, that it's an idea, that it's not necessarily a product of scientific research.
That's another point. Close the door.
Or
please,
discovery.
Everyone mute your phones, please.
And since the 1940s in particular, right, we use this term, and a growing number of us have tried to make clear that even though it is an invention, that it still has very real consequences. And we see that playing out, today quite a bit, right? So when you think about race and the way it's been institutionalized literally since the 18th century as a worldview, as a way of being, but we cannot talk about race without talking about whiteness and white identity. And when we think about whiteness and white racialized identity, and it's important to frame racialization as an act, not as something that just exists, but as an action that is taken by people to racialize others. That whiteness in itself has become the custom, the norm, the culture, the standard by which all other groups are compared. Without the idea and construction of whiteness historically, then the concept of Black or Latinx or Asian in the way that we engage those today would be non-existent. They wouldn't really matter, right? So to talk about race and not center that also in talking around whiteness really does a disservice to the conversation in itself. It's a wrong footing, and epistemologically is probably does a disservice, is antithetic to actually our efforts to dismantling racism and white supremacy. And the other part that I want to share around why it's important is because as we today start to think around anti-racism and what that means, the action that it requires, we have to think about the way that we need to name issues of race and social difference, particularly as issues of power and equity, rather than as matters of cultural and ethnic variety, for example. So we got to really draw deeply and broadly to make connections between the ways that race intersects with the construction of gender, with the construction of sex, with the construction of religion, and the ways that those are then connected to capitalism and today's practice of neocolonialism. For example, we've had 250 years of slavery. We've had a bit over 90 years of Jim Crow laws, 60 years of separate but equal. So I need folks to kind of do some math with that. When you think about the wealth that one group can accumulate both in power, but also financially and economically, that other people did not elect to participate in, but that they were told, you cannot participate in this, you cannot engage in these activities, or we will lynch you, we will kill you, right? This wasn't an option. This was stay in your place. There's a contemporary young prophet, I like to, Immortal Technique, who has a particular lyric in his music that says, it's more than racism, it's stay in your place-ism. And that's what we've kind of seen today. So then we add to that 40 years of redlining, we add the Indian reservations, and the treaties that have been broken, the Homestead Act that gave mostly lands to white colonizers. And then we add to that also the Asian Exclusion Act in 1924 that was meant to preserve American homogeneity. When we look at all those things, then we have to think about what does that mean today? What's the legacy? What's the residue? How are we wrestling and struggling? And why is it that in corporations and education and law and these different entities that we see that diversity where it does exist is literally at the bottom? And then you see none of that diversity at the top, decision-making or executive leadership across different organizations, which is a big part of the issue of we don't have that leadership at the top. But then on the other hand, we're not addressing the idea and issue of power and how power is tied to race and who really gets to decide what's what and what goes where. So I don't want to say too much more. I know we have a conversation that we're going to have here in this next, 45 minutes. My brother Davon Wright, I know has also an opener. I want to respect that. But generally, I hope that offers a timeline of the ways in which race has been legalized and instituted into the structure that continues to run how we operate today.
Profound. Thank you, Dr. Benitez. Now, Dr. Davon, let's go. What do you think?
Thank you for having me, Monica Williams and Virtual Voices. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this awesome discussion here. Dr. Michael Benitez, he covered so much territory, in understanding white supremacy. You have to understand it's a global phenomenon and its historical reach and its geographic reach and its socio-political reach. Perhaps here in the United States, we have a rather narrow focus about understanding white supremacy as a system of domination. But, the United States, for example, inherited plantation slavery from its former colonial master, Great Britain. Great Britain was part of a larger colonial competitive project in Western Europe to impose upon the world its vision of society, its systems. And so we really have to situate white supremacy as a system in this particular, geographic context in the United States in a broader historical, global geopolitical understanding. All right, so that's number one. But where the United States is concerned, you're not going to understand US history at all without examining race. American society has always ever been defined by race. More specifically, our society has been structured by unequal power dynamics, unequal racial power dynamics. US society begins with foundational myths: the myth of inherent white superiority, the myth of non-white inferiority in general as the basis for a white-ruled racial hierarchy, with non-whites as its subservient class, ever working to measure up to the presumed superior race. So white supremacist ideology becomes the basis upon which US institutions are defined and continue to be defined up to the present day. Now, the way in which race defines unequal power dynamics, as Dr. Benitez pointed out, should not be disconnected from an understanding of how it is entangled with other forms of oppression. Just as white supremacy has historically structured US society, so too has the myths of inherent male superiority and a belief in the inherent superiority of the wealthy. So racism, sexism, classism are interrelated, overlapping, intersecting modes of unequal power dynamics that have defined the American experience. And so people really need to understand that, racism as a phenomenon is a messy thing, perhaps as scholars, as social thinkers, for the convenience of conceptualizing society, we reduce things to a very simple unit of analysis: race, gender, class. But in reality, society doesn't work that way. Society is a very entangled mess of unequal power dynamics. And that's really the proper way in which we should situate an understanding of racism as part of a multiplicity of systems of oppression.
Very good. Thank you so much. I really want to talk a little bit more and dig deeper into the systems that have the remnants of this, very complex, racialized history. Let's talk a little bit more about how they're showing up today, because I want people to be able to draw the connection, because sometimes we might miss it because of our lens being very limited and us not being directly impacted by it. So if we could just go into more detail about what the systems look like today that we inherited it from, throughout history.
Yeah, I'll just, right? I mean, when you look at data across every spectrum of American society and its economy, you'll find that when you look at poverty, you see who's at the top, you see who's at the bottom, you see who's being displaced and gentrified and pushed out of the communities, and who has the wealth. And we see that in Denver quite a bit, happening no different than other places across the nation. When you look at unemployment rates, it's another way that we've inherited. And when you look at studies about who gets employed and the way biases, which is a kind, gentle way of saying racism, show up. You see that in the way that we're resegregating schools by defunding public schools, by defunding a public state education and taking away the funds there and creating charter schools, where we're seeing sort of a resegregation emerge, in some cases even a little bit worse in some areas than Jim Crow period. The prison industrial complex, who gets locked up? Who gets to shoot somebody and get arrested safely? And who gets to shoot somebody and be offered a hamburger and a bulletproof vest and treated with kindness and respect? The voting rights, we saw that emerge quite a bit with respect to actions and behaviors of voter suppression. And then I'll add in immigration. So those are 6 ways right there in which we've not only inherited this legacy, but we continue to grapple with our own ideal inheritance generationally of this inheritance, of this racist ideas and this white supremacist structure. And it's embedded into this, and that's the beauty of white supremacy, unfortunately, is that the system metamorphosizes and shifts to resistance. And so when we're talking about how it shows up today, most of the time, because it's not marked, it's not as visible as the disparities that we see affecting, especially BIPOC communities.
So I have 3 texts in mind in order to answer this question. In attempting, even though racism in the way that we understand it today is wrapped up in our understanding of this 21st century global information age of instantaneous transactions, instantaneous communication, technological innovation. We shouldn't fool ourselves into the idea that, you know, people of previous generations, because they didn't benefit from, I guess, our access to information and technological innovation, were necessarily more racist, were necessarily, you know, more driven to racial exclusion and racial domination than we are today. Perhaps we're more sophisticated about it. Maybe that's a way of approaching it. So in attempting to understand the persistence of the brutality, the violence of white supremacy, historian Carol Anderson, in her book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, she writes that, quote, "It's not about visible violence, but rather works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a range of governmental bureaucracies. The systematized nature of anti-Black violence, for example, is not centered in the most obvious manifestations of white supremacist terrorism, such as what we saw on January 6th, which we can get into later, or the Klan or any other white militia organization, but it is instead positioned in, as Carol Anderson says, quote, the halls of power, where it can achieve its ends more effectively, far more destructively. And as Michelle Alexander, in her book, the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration and the Age of Colorblindness, says, quote, the current system of control permanently locks a huge percentage of the African-American community out of the mainstream society and economy and functions more like a caste system. I know Americans, you know, that word really might irritate some people in their sense of patriotism, you know, operates as a caste system than a system of crime control. And the systematic exclusion of African-Americans from mainstream life, as Thomas M. Shapiro in his book, The Hidden Cost of Being African-American observes, can also be seen in the racial wealth gap, where he says, quote, many whites continue to reap advantages from the historical, institutional, structural, and personal dynamics of racial inequality. So those are, you know, three reference texts that sort of give us an idea of the modern 21st century ways in which racism, white supremacy as a system of oppression plays itself out.
Thank you. Were you gonna
and I want, may I add to, you know, Devin, what I appreciate about what you pointed out, and we see it very clearly, not only with the January 6th event. I mean, you can have a clearer example of the ways when you think about Black Lives Matters activists who were, you know, peacefully protesting until, you know, they were instigated, and also had infiltrators go into those movements to try to make some noise and create some violence in there. And the violence, the explicit and outward covert violence that we saw transpire on January 6th, and the way that we responded to those folks in particular, right? And that, I think, for me, really captures the difference in treatment. So what we have is a state that criminalizes the Black body, the brown body, but I do want to lean particularly on the dark skin body. Let me be clear about that. And in doing so, you have, you know, people who get not only targeted and criminalized, but you see it every day where, you know, safety is associated with Black bodies in a way that is threatening. And yet that same idea, it doesn't play the same way across the board. So that's why we have quite a bit of Black people who, even without no threat to anyone, even as young as the young Rice, who was, you know, shot, because they criminalized him, you get them getting shot by police, and then we create excuses and rationalize why we shot them. But the people who are going on shooting sprees, shooting up theaters, shooting up churches, who very clearly engaged in murder and killed other people, they get arrested safely. And so what we saw there, unfortunately, is and I know folks don't really like to hear this, but it's also very honest, and I say it with deep love and respect, was the protection of whiteness and white supremacy as by the state, and the violence that comes with it. And that's a big part of what we need to address.
Thank you so much. What do you say to the person who says, I agree, these systems. I wasn't around when all of these systems were created. Now, me, I know that I would say you're a benefactor though. You're a benefactor of these systems. But what do you tell someone who says, I'm not a racist, I want to help?
If I heard you correctly, because the audio was breaking up a bit, what do you tell, what is the answer to a person who sees themselves living in the present and therefore in their mind disconnected from what they see as a very old, outdated, irrelevant system of racism that no longer touches the lives of contemporary people that are living in the present day? I mean, I've heard that all my life. I have so many answers for that. I've heard that all my life. I mean, there are rude, sarcastic answers that I have for questions like that. But, you know, to give a more polite answer, it reminds me of the idea that Black people or people of color in general have really nothing to complain about, because living in the 21st century, right, they themselves are not slaves. Perhaps their ancestors were. And so you're living in the benefits of the ways in which the United States has improved itself since, for example, the Civil Rights era. So, you know, you're disconnected from a past that, you know, we can study academically and make sense of, but it's not directly affecting your life. And, you know, to go back again to the very instructive events of January 6th, or just the past 4 years of the Trump administration, or even before that, the 8 years of the Obama administration and the backlash to the very idea of not only a Black president, but the audacity of a Black family in the White House, being Black, stirred up a lot of stuff that perhaps in the United States we went to sleep about. I would say growing up in the late 80s and growing up in the 90s and then going to college, there was this movement known as multiculturalism, a movement to appreciate diversity, to tolerate difference, to incorporate different experiences and accept them as all, you know, American identities that are on equal terms. When I was living through that experience, I was highly critical of it. Yeah, there were aspects of it that annoyed me because I ever felt like it was defined according to the standard of whiteness. I would see images, for example, on television of representations of diversity and multiculturalism, where multiculturalism meant tossing in a Black face into a sea of whiteness and calling that diversity, right? And it was annoying, but it was hilarious to me. However, the point that I want to make is the effect that it had is it perhaps convinced mainstream American society that racism was no longer a problem, or that if racism still exists, it's people in pointy white hats. It's people with, you know, neo-Nazi symbolism. These people have been marginalized. I remember growing up, I remember seeing a lot of Hollywood movies. I remember seeing a lot of daytime talk shows where the guests would be avowed racists, but essentially they would be the butt of jokes. They would be there so people can ridicule them and point out and say, you're out of step with the mainstream, get with it, okay? And so a lot of that, and there were a lot of Hollywood movies too, you know, The Hills Have Eyes, where representations of racism was poorly uneducated white people living out in the hills in, you know, wherever America. That's the way to understand racism, that because you haven't spent enough time around, you know, diverse cultures, Black people, that's why you're racist. And I think a lot of that multicultural ideology brainwashed us into the false notion that racism was no longer a central problem in American life. And so when Obama becomes president, right, the initial narrative is post-racialism, right? Now we can talk about and really celebrate the culmination of multiculturalism with the election of the first Black president. Shut up about it. We're tired of hearing about it. You got your Black president. And then the ugliness started to come out, right? I mean, you people have to remind themselves, how did Trump become the leader of the MAGA movement? It wasn't with the declaration of his candidacy in 2015. It was his successful attempt. We can debate about that, but successful to the extent that he mobilized a movement, an oppositional movement, organized around the idea that Obama was a foreign-born Muslim infiltrator, was not legitimate. They even questioned his college grades, I think, too, right? That his Blackness could not be assaulted directly. Had to find other interesting ways of delegitimizing him. So that was one initial wake-up moment, right? Donald Trump successfully mobilizing a movement against Obama and what he represented based on xenophobia, you know, bigotry, that sort of thing, Islamophobia. But then, you know, when he declares his candidacy, you see a lot of the other racist tropes come to the fore again, right? Demonizing Latinos, Mexicans in particular, as rapists and criminals. Then we should also remind ourselves, during the Republican primary debates in 2016, before Donald Trump secured the candidacy in 2016, he was not the only candidate to support the idea of banning Muslims from the White House and from the country. He's not the only one. Donald Trump was perhaps the most successful political candidate to draw on all of these deep-rooted, bigoted notions, xenophobic notions. But to go back to the events of January 6th, that, to my mind, represents a very instructional moment, right? It really like the 8 years of the Obama presidency, right? Like, you know, the birther conspiracy, right? It really shows us, it really exposes us in a very naked fashion how things that we perhaps thought were settled, right? That were long time ago, that we don't need to really delve into deeply anymore, are in fact not. So, I mean, I can comment more about the events of January 6th, but I'll give more time to my co-panelists there.
Yeah, no, I'm appreciating. I want to, you know, echo literally everything Devon Devon just said, and in particular, I think to talk about multiculturalism is so important because it truly did become a movement that didn't account for power. It was almost like in colleges when we have diverse students and we do a potluck and we're like, hey, everybody, I want everyone to bring a different food from your respective culture, right? And yet we don't look inward and think about what that conversation looks like. And what it did in some ways, it also allowed people in centralizing this norm and thinking about whiteness to not think about the ways in which that idea as a cultural practice can also be practiced by non-white people. And I want to be clear with that one because I think that's a big part of the conversation today that, oh, Black people could be racist, Latinx people could be racist. And it's so important to make clear that even individually as non-white people can make racialized and racist comments, those are still grounded in white supremacy and whiteness. They're not part of the Black or African diaspora. They're not part of our cultural aesthetics and how we function. Those are all learned through the cultivation of this system. And the other piece that I want to kind of build on and add to that in particular is the need to tie diversity, not just as this representation of different people, not that's just as this diverse outlook of characteristics and how people show up, but diversity is really about the decision-making and the power tied behind to that representation. Who gets to make decisions? When people say evaluate, what are we evaluating and what standards are we using? When we make budgetary, especially resource financial decisions, how are we making those? And what are we privileging? And how are we construing that as some unified voice as opposed to understanding and really marking that for the politics of what people want and what they don't want to address? So those really become incredibly important in understanding the dynamics of today, how these show up today, and how we choose to lean on anti-racist work moving forward. Because here's the reality. When you look at images historically of lynchings, I'm gonna go there. These very people, after they're done with a lynching of a Black body, or they're done with a burning of a Black body, they went home and they were the nicest, kindest, loving people, treated their children with the absolute most love, right? And so what we have to understand about racism is that mostly everyone, if not everyone, is racist, but just because they're racist or racially ignorant doesn't mean that they're not nice. It doesn't mean that they're not a loving father or mother or cousin or friend. It doesn't mean they're bad people. But we have to be able, with honesty, to address the idea of race and racism. And so to anyone, for example, I hear a lot of the, I don't see color. I hear a lot of the, everyone is equal and everyone is human. There's an importance to continuing to recognize race because of the consequences that exist as a result of. So that white privilege then is more about a white person not even worried about getting pulled over just for driving versus the Black person that has to worry about getting pulled over from the moment he wakes up to the moment he goes to bed, if he can go to bed at all.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one piece to that? I do want to say that the pervasive belief that Black people commit the most crimes is a racist notion that, one, completely ignores the long, brutally violent history of the criminality of white supremacist terrorist groups that Dr. Benitez just referred to in the form of lynching, white mob violence, that in the 20th century destroyed entire Black towns across the country and produced the sacrificing of Black bodies to the gods of white supremacy and the brutal, murderous ritualism of lynching. Number two, causes law enforcement institutions to disproportionately scrutinize Black behavior for evidence in support of the preconceived conclusion of inherent Black criminality. Number three, causes law enforcement to be less attentive to white criminality, or even when presented with the blatant obviousness of white criminality, such as January 6th, to charge less, to prosecute less, to sentence less harshly than the exact same criminal offenses or less by Black people with similar or no criminal backgrounds. Yeah, this is, I think this is lost on people in their imagination in trying to understand racism, that part of racism is rooted in foundational myths. And again,
that's right.
One of the foundational myths is that whiteness comes with a certain amount of presumed innocence, and not non-whiteness in general, it is safe to assume is rooted in criminality, inappropriateness, impoliteness, being loud, being uncivilized, not being well-behaved, and therefore needing to be policed in a way that whiteness does not need to be policed.
Yeah, and that has the historical context that we must talk about. The fact that Blacks were seen as less human, less intelligent, subhuman beings in order to justify the condition or being able to, hold them as free laborers, slaves. And so that perception, like if we could do anything, it would be to challenge the thoughts and the myths that still put people of color and Blacks at the bottom, right? Some rise to the top, but at the bottom in a systematic way that plays out in corporations, in companies. I mean, I've been a part of some major corporations and government institutions where targets, like I'm not talking about like this passive approach, but I'm talking about being directly targeted. And I can't associate it with anything else but me being who I am.
Yeah,
right?
No, and Monica, one of the things that I think, I want to kind of build on what Devon said, after Barack Obama was elected, when you look at research studies and reports, especially of students and communities, one of the biggest significant findings in that data, in that research, is Black and brown, but especially Black people saying that his presidency made it worse for them in their respective communities. Not better, but worse, because of the scapegoat of now having a Black president. But I do want to point to a particular just question or a comment that was made there around Black on Black conflict or indigenous to indigenous conflict. And I want to just respectfully respond, because I get the question, was there conflict and tension prior to the construction of racism? Absolutely. I mean, violence goes way back into our humanity, but that violence wasn't yet race-based. It wasn't racialized. The marker of race and why and who can be racist, it really relies upon that construction and foundation, so that even if you had a particular conflict or tensions between different people, indigenous communities here, or whether that's elsewhere around the world, it wasn't race-based conflict. It wasn't racialized conflict. It wasn't, hey, I'm coming at you like this because I've learned and I've been told that you're inferior and that you're really trying to kill me, or if I let you get away with it, you might just do away with me. No, right? And I think that when we have those conversations, and I'm trying to kind of put it in very practical terms, we have to think about that historical implication and element, because it's not just how about Black on Black crime? How about this and that crime? At the end, all of that, it's still, right? Because when you see, what you see there is a fighting for the crumbs. It's still grounded in white supremacy. And that's, I think, part of what I really would like folks, hopefully, to walk away with foundationally, is that element around cultural practice is so important, the way we've internalized race and racism, and our inability to reflect on the way that that we have, and especially white people, have benefited over, you know, centuries of excluding some. And so let me be clear that, yes, was much of this done prior to 1776? Even the idea of whiteness thrown around wasn't really yet this thing that was legalized, right? So beyond being seen, Monica, it was legally defined by the US that if you were Black, you weren't fully human, and that's the law. To your point earlier around slavery and some of those issues. Right. And so even as racism was built as a result of the need for free labor, right? It doesn't make it any less impactful, any less consequential, any less egregious, because we still haven't even grappled and wrestled with that at all. No one truly within the US sort of culture, outside of scholars and historians, perhaps the activists, but anyone there has not truly yet said, hey, because we did this, this is what is happening, what has happened, and why we're wrestling with. So we need to be able to address that root in particular, so that we could uproot racism and invest in a system that is racially and democratically just and inclusive, with full participation, and that accounts for the equitable distribution of power.
Right. Yeah, it's problematic for me when someone brings up, what about this? What about Black on Black crime? Which really is not a thing, because we don't talk about white on white crime in the same way. And so it's important to not deflect and be distracted, or like, okay, this thing over here, because that doesn't change the lived experiences of people of color that were racialized for that reason. And so it's important to not take away from the issue at hand, because to me, that's also like all lives matter. It's the same difference to me. And so we have to really, in order for us to change and to reconstruct something that is more equitable, more intentionally, we have to realize and recognize where we went wrong to begin with. And now let's fix it, right? And that doesn't mean that we become defensive about it. It means that we say, okay, we got to do something about this. And I see more and more people doing that. But until we face the facts and the history and the source, the root cause of where we are today, it will never change, which is why we're still talking about it. Why are we still talking about it? Because we haven't truly faced it and addressed it.
No, indeed. Indeed, Monica.
Yeah. So we're at 11:50. And so in kind of some last remarks and kind of wrap this up, because I know people, oftentimes I get people want a checklist. Like, I know there's no checklist to end racism. I get it. But what is it that we would want people to take away from this? What is it that we should instruct others to do and to take back into the systems and the institutions that are leaving some out and providing benefits to others? What is the one thing that we want people to take back from this conversation?
You know, this is always a difficult question for me to answer, because there's just so much crap to do.
Yeah.
You know, what do I mean by that? I mean that an hour from now, later on today, tomorrow, a month from now, despite my personal dedication to being an anti-racist, someone who looks just like me or myself could again be murdered by the police, right? And, you know, I'm thinking about how I felt seeing that nearly 9-minute video of George Floyd casually getting murdered, right? Slowly, the life being taken away from him. And I'm thinking about research that I'm trying to pursue, right? In the subject of racism that I can get published. I'm thinking about the upcoming fall semester. I'm also thinking about, you know, my own personal interests, you know, just being a human. And it's really, really hard. I'm speaking on, I guess I'm trying to speak on behalf of people of color in general, Black people in particular, who are decidedly about anti-racist work in whatever capacity, you know, as a consultant speaking on issues of diversity and inclusion, as an academic like myself, you know, or just a person out there in the street holding up a sign, trying to call out, you know, systems of injustice. But, you know, the system still exists, right? You know, how I felt after seeing what happened to George Floyd is the same way that I felt after the fact, learning about the murder of Elijah McClain in Aurora, Colorado, right? And I moved here in summer of 2018. And so that event, I think it happened August 2019. I think that's when it happened. And so this is, you know, approximately a year after I arrived here. I hadn't heard about it at the time. I had not heard about it. I did not hear about that event until after the tragic murder of George Floyd, right? So my point is, there's a lot of work to do, and it's hard. I just want to acknowledge, I want to give voice to the difficulty, the emotional weight, the emotional baggage, the depressing causing experience of living in this skin, wanting to combat white supremacy, but you don't know, like, right? You know, after this forum is over, or right now, there could be another event happening that makes this forum a necessity, you know? So my first answer is, I don't know what to tell people to do, but my second answer is, here are some things that you can try. I would say, as a foundation, stay ever informed, stay ever hungry to be informed, right? Part of being an intellectual is just being curious and not being satisfied with what authority figures in your life have given you, your parents, your church leaders, your teachers, you know. And when I say question things, I'm not really talking about someone who sits in front of their computer watching YouTube conspiratorial videos that are filling in some preconceived narrative, right? I mean, really, you know, really investigate things. Heated, uncomfortable, even angry debate with people who you happen to disagree with, I think is and can be a valuable process for self-discovery, right? I think here in the United States in particular, you know, some minutes ago, I was beating up on multiculturalism. Multiculturalism also convinced us that, you know, we sort of need to get along and find agreement. I think it's overrated. I think coming to an agreement about a particular subjects as complicated as racial oppression, is perhaps overrated. I think heated debate, people getting uncomfortable, angry, spit flying from the mouth, can be a very valuable learning process. Because think about how difficult it is for people of color to experience racism, right? And so if you're, as a white person, uncomfortable about dialoguing about racism, I would invite you into the discomfort of dialoguing about racism on a regular basis, as much of an opportunity as you have. That would be my suggestion.
I know that we have to move quickly, so I'm gonna be quick with mine, and building on what Devon has suggested, and that is, first, one thing is, and to the point made, people must have a capacity for self-awareness, self-reflection, self-assessment of one's own beliefs and how those inform their biases and values, even when they show up in the workplace or in any space that they feel. Number two, I will suggest for people to really think about building a consciousness of the dynamics inherent when people from different groups interact. Even here in the conversation, people are at different places. You probably have some people on here who are like, yes, yes, yes. You have some people on here who are like, yo, what the hell is this? And you have some people in here in the middle who are like, just grappling and kind of putting all the pieces together. I call that respectful erroring. We must not look to bash people, but to allow for a certain level of respectful erroring, so as long as it doesn't cross that boundary of respect, right? It's one thing to say I disagree. It's another thing to say, oh, y'all should be gone and you don't belong. Two very different ways of saying something. Three, we need to be mindful of the role that power and culture play in human society, relations, particularly tied to the racial foundations of the society and this nation. Four, that we have an appreciation or engage these conversations with an appreciation and ability to adapt to varying communication styles, intercultural communication styles, and the way that we learn and approach the conversation. And then lastly, the value difference offers. So when we have these conversations, two things I want to add. Be mindful of who bears the brunt of injustice, one, and two, resources, 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 resources. We must stop asking people of color to do this work for free or as additive to everything they do. We must invest. People, right, even organizations and corporations, the first thing that they say is, put your money where your mouth is. So I'm asking everyone here, put your money where your mouth is. If this is important to your organization, to you, to the work that you do, invest in the material resources that are required to address this issue. And then lastly, model what you preach. Do not ask of someone to engage in a way or to have a conversation you yourself will not do. I see that all the time. So let's model what we preach. And those are my suggestions.
Thank you so much. What a powerful conversation. This was so much needed. And just to add, I go back to James Baldwin as you talk about like this disagreement, and I love it. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to live. That's how I would like to sum it up in terms of the disagreement. But I do agree, like we have to challenge the status quo. And I'd also add, put your power where your mouth is. Put your power where your mouth is. And if we start to do that and start to do the research, the self-exploration, and get to know like how we got here, because that's what this conversation is all about, how we got here. But the key to how we got here is, how do we not stay here? How do we not stay here? How do we change the trajectory? I have 2, 3 beautiful sons, and I don't want to see them still dealing with the same stuff that we're dealing with today. So how do we change that trajectory for those generations that are coming? And so, yes, this has been a very great conversation. I've appreciated being here. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we have just some final remarks, but thank you all so much for being here. And I hope you got as much out of this as I did.
Thank you, Monica. Dr. Benitez, Dr. Wright, on behalf of all the comments, unbelievable conversation. I can't believe we were able to get this much in an hour. However, I can also believe it because of your gifted talents and your perspective. So thank you. I want to close with just two quick things. One, yes, we are going to have more conversations like this. This is a series that we plan to continue for as long as necessary. History cannot be done in 1 hour. It can't be done in 100 hours, right? But we know we want to focus on it one more time. So we are going to have another session, February 18th. How do we get here, part 2? And we're really going to look at specifically Colorado's history and what role that's played in race and racism and how it's still here and alive today. So join us on February 18th. We will again continue this series. And as Monica mentioned in the beginning, looking at systemic racism. What do those systems look like right now? How can we all hold each other accountable and work towards this? We'll also dive into that individual perspective and how can we help individually in this role. And then at some point looking at collective impact. So we hope you'll continue to join us. I want to take a side note here. I know we have to go. The comments were spectacular. I think Dr. Benitez, what you said about this respectful erroring and how important, Dr. Wright, that you said keeping this conversation about race is going, even if it's uncomfortable. We witnessed that in this chat. If y'all were paying attention, it's unbelievable what was happening. And that to me is some action that's happening as we speak. So thank you for allowing this group to do that. And thank you to the audience for engaging in that way. That was profound. Finally, one more thing we just want to say on behalf of the Leadership Foundation, we have a few other upcoming events that we'd love you to consider being a part of. Meet the finalists. We have a 9 News Leader of the Year award that we announce every year in March. We'd love for you to come meet them, hear more about some of our spectacular leaders in this community. And then the CLA Mentors Walk, this is where you would have an opportunity, any of you on this call, to become a mentor for a walk. It's a virtual walk with some collegiate leaders in our community and just really be able to offer them what your leadership journey has looked like. If you're interested in that, join us, check it out on denverleadership.org. And again, Monica for moderating beautifully and being a part of this conversation. Dr. Benitez for all your work in helping to make this happen with us. And Dr. Wright for your perspectives. You guys were tremendous. Clapping from everybody. If we were in person, we'd be deaf. Y'all are amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And we'll see you on February 18th.